Welcome to The Explainer. We're diving into a question that has really been at the heart of Christian thought for centuries. If God is all powerful, then why was the crucifixion actually necessary? We're going to explore the classic theological arguments that try to get to the bottom of that very question. So, this is the big one, right? It's the central mystery. Thinkers like Anselm of Canterbury were wrestling with this ages ago. If God has unlimited power, why would something as brutal as the crucifixion be required for salvation? I mean, was there really no other way?
Okay, so before we can even get into the why of it all, we first have to understand the motivation behind the cross in the first place. The whole event is framed not as a problem God had to solve, but as this ultimate act of love.
And this idea of sovereign love is absolutely key. We're not talking about some generic, vague affection here. This is a specific, purposeful, distinguishing love. And that completely reframes the question, doesn't it? The cross isn't about earning God's love. It's the ultimate expression of a love that was already there from the very beginning. And of course, this verse, probably the most famous one there is, illustrates that point perfectly. It's presented as the foundation for everything. The giving of the Son flows from God's love. Love is the cause, and the cross is the effect. It's an act that's completely rooted in a free and sovereign choice. So, let's follow that logic. If the cross is an act of love, why this specific act? Well, there are two main schools of thought that try to answer that, and honestly, they offer very different perspectives. All right, this slide really gets to the heart of the debate. On one side, you've got hypothetical necessity, which comes from brilliant minds like Augustine and Aquinas. They basically believed God could have used other means, but he chose the cross because it was the wisest and most graceful way. But then, on the other side, you have consequent absolute necessity. This view argues that once God decided he was going to save people, the cross was actually the only way to do it that was consistent with his perfect nature. Now, the argument we're following is going to build a case for one of these views, specifically for consequent absolute necessity. And it does this by laying out 6 pretty distinct lines of evidence from Scripture. So let's walk through them one by one. First up, the first piece of evidence. This one looks at some very specific language used in the book of Hebrews in the New Testament. Words like appropriate and behooved, they suggest something much more than just a good idea. They imply a requirement, right? A kind of divine necessity that's rooted in God's very nature. This points to the idea that Christ's suffering wasn't just a choice. It was fulfilling a deep structural need. Okay, the second piece of evidence. This one considers the alternatives, or maybe more accurately, the lack of alternatives that are presented in the Gospel of John. The crucial point here is how this passage frames the situation. It's an either-or. Either the Son is given, or humanity perishes. There's no third option on the table. The implication is pretty clear. This was the singular, necessary remedy for the problem. All right, for our third line of reasoning, we're heading back to the book of Hebrews. But this time, we're going a layer deeper. We're focusing on the unique person of Christ and just how serious sin really is. Now, this next point is really fascinating because it kind of flips our usual way of thinking on its head. We often see the Old Testament sacrifices as patterns that pointed forward to Christ's sacrifice. But the author of Hebrews argues the complete opposite. He says the earthly sacrifices were just copies of a heavenly exemplar, and that exemplar was Christ's sacrifice itself. So, what does that actually mean? Well, it boils down to 3 big things. First, the seriousness of sin demands a real, absolute solution, not a hypothetical one. Second, only a totally unique person, both God and man, could possibly offer that kind of perfect sacrifice. And third, because this sacrifice is tied to eternal realities, it couldn't just be some optional, temporary plan. The earthly sacrifices needed blood because Christ's ultimate sacrifice, the heavenly original, absolutely required it. Moving on to our fourth argument, we're shifting gears a bit now, from the sacrifice itself to its legal effect. We're focusing on the idea of justification. The logic on this one is actually pretty direct. Think of it this way. To be saved means to be justified or declared righteous in God's eyes. But how can an imperfect person ever be declared righteous? Well, the argument is that it requires a perfect righteousness to be credited to their account, and that righteousness could only come from Christ's perfect life and his sacrifice. As the book of Galatians puts it, if righteousness could have come any other way, it would have. All right, let's look at evidence number 5. This one looks at the cross as a sort of public demonstration. But a demonstration of what? Of God's love. Seriously, think about it for a second. Why is the cross considered the ultimate display of love? The argument is that its power is directly tied to its incredible cost. If a less costly sacrifice were even possible, then the cross would no longer be the supreme act of love. Its absolute necessity is what makes its cost, and therefore the love it displays, so incredibly profound. And that brings us to our final piece of evidence, number 6. This one is rooted in the very character of God himself, specifically his justice.
See, God's holiness isn't just a feature, it's who he is. It's non-negotiable. And because of this, his just nature must react against sin. This isn't a choice, it's a necessity of his character. This demand for justice requires a payment, a satisfaction. The cross therefore becomes absolutely necessary to satisfy God's perfect law, allowing him to be both just and the justifier.
So we've walked through 6 pretty distinct lines of evidence. Where does all of this leave us? What's the final verdict from this whole theological deep dive? Well, the idea is that when you stack all these arguments up, from the specific language of Scripture to the nature of sin to the demands of perfect justice, they all start pointing in the same direction. They suggest the cross wasn't just the best option on the table, it was the only possible way for a perfectly just and loving God to save humanity, once he chose to do so. And look at that. This quote brings us right back to where we started, sovereign love. The conclusion is that understanding the absolute necessity of the cross doesn't diminish God's love at all. In fact, it magnifies it. The fact that justice demanded such an immense and costly payment makes the love that was willing to pay it all the more incredible. And that's really the final challenging thought we're left with. It forces us to weigh the cost. If an easier path, a less costly sacrifice, actually existed, would the cross truly be the ultimate demonstration of both perfect justice and incomprehensible love? It's a question that really gets to the very heart of what the atonement means.